We're going to dive into consequences of population distribution. So what happens when people are clustered near the coast or more dispersed in rural areas? That's what we're going to talk about. So on the image on the left is somewhere in rural Florida. I don't know exactly where. I think it's kind of west of Fort Lauderdale area. I think that's where the picture is taken. But what is the consequences of people living in more rural areas? Well, people are typically more employed in agriculture. People are, of course, more spread out. There's a lot less cultural exchange. Typically, there's a lot less cultural and ethnic diversity. These are just things that are coming to my mind initially. And then looking at the image on the right, this is of Miami, Florida. So what happens when people are clustered near the coast? We see a lot more tourism driven here. We see a lot more economic and job opportunities in quantities. We also see typically crime rates are going to be a little bit higher. You have a lot more criminals in one area. If you live near the coast, of course, you're going to have more tropical architecture. That's a cultural element as well. So yeah, I see a lot more diversity in terms of the population in ethnic and religious groups as well. So these are just things that are coming to mind. Well, let's dive into ESPN. ESPN, we're talking about sports. Not really. We're going to talk about economic, social, political, and environmental consequences of population distribution. So let's start with economic effects. So typically in areas with high population density, we see a larger accessible labor pool. So we see a lot more people in a small amount of land, more accessible to work. So this can support people who have a diverse amount of interests and drives and passions, as well as supports different industries. You can have a lot more diversity in the skills people have, so there could be a lot more diversity in the industries. So this can lead to economic growth. This is a picture in Singapore, which is a country that is a 100% urbanized. So they have a very high population density. So we can see here there's a lot of buildings, so it can support a lot of people. So we have a very large labor pool, and it's very economically developed as a result. So a concentration of economic activity can lead to investment. So investment can lead to new businesses and infrastructure development. We can see investment from other countries as well into businesses. We can also see countries putting in locations and stores, branches, headquarters internationally as well. And this will further drive urban development. Now, if you have a lot of people in one area, there could be competition for jobs or jobs in certain sectors. In New York City, in the Broadway area, there's a lot of competition for roles in productions. We can have manufacturing or service-based economies. Typically, urban and city developments start out in manufacturing, and then as time goes on for about 100 years or so at least, then it turns into more service-based industries. Investments can be done by governments. They can be done by private sectors like businesses. They can prioritize healthcare services because there's a lot of medical needs of a larger population, maybe a lot more diverse needs. Areas with high population density are going to be in areas where diseases like the cold or flu may be more easily transmitted because everyone's touching the same surfaces, everyone's breathing the same air. They're so close together that it can spread diseases a lot quicker. So this will lead to more hospitals and clinics developing in areas with high population densities, as well as more specialized hospitals and clinics. You're probably going to find a lot more OBGYNs in an urban area than a rural area. We also see a higher cost of living. Products tend to be more expensive in urban areas. We also see more income disparities. With more people and a diverse amount of jobs and types of jobs, people are going to be earning different incomes, different pays. So there's going to be a lot more expansion in the number of rich people compared to the number of poor people and middle class and upper middle class individuals. So areas within the city, like London, for example, or New York or other major cities, will have areas that are typically more expensive, like Billionaires Row in New York City, in Manhattan, and areas that are a little more less expensive to live in. So look at Texas here. So Texas hospital beds in use by region. That's what the map on the right shows, and the map on the left shows population growth. So in areas with higher population growth, where population density is higher, there's a lot more clusters and populations, there's a lot more hospital beds in use. So what this means is that areas that are more urban or areas that have higher population densities need more hospitals, need more medical care facilities. They're in higher demand. So their investments can be put into those areas. There's going to be more medical education emphasized in those areas as well. People may tend to move there because of the great hospitals there. So let's look at economic effects of low population density. So areas that have low population density typically have economies that are driven from agriculture, forestry, fishing, and mining. All of these industries are considered part of the primary sector. And what this means is that these industries extract resources from the world, from the actual environment, and they support national production. A lot of the service-based industries in urban areas can support very local production. They can support worldwide production as well, but these raw goods will support production internationally. Oil, for example, extracted in the Middle East will support the entire world and will affect the entire world's economy. We can also see stimulations of a lot more smaller businesses. We see a lot more chains and multinational corporations in urban areas. We see a lot of local entrepreneurship in rural areas that will cater to the needs of the residents because there's a lot less diversity and there's not as many tourists. We also could see a limited access of job and economic opportunities in low population densities as well. In this map, I guess this map's important because I put it on here, it shows poverty rates. So we can see here that the pink shaded regions are urban counties of Florida, and then the green shaded regions are rural counties of Florida. And we can kind of see a pattern that the rural counties typically have higher poverty rates than the urban counties in Florida. And maybe we could link that back to the limited access to job and economic opportunities. But cost of living is also lower in rural areas. So people may not see a need to earn as high of an income. Like look at Tallahassee. That's kind of an outlier in that region on the panhandle. Because, yeah, cost of living is higher, so people are going to need to earn a lot higher to be able to support themselves. Now, what are the social effects of high population density? Well, we see more better and specialized healthcare facilities, specialists in certain parts of medicine, as well as more and diverse medical resources. So this picture is of Advent Health in Orlando, Florida, and this facility has the most hospital beds out of any hospital in the nation. It has, I think, 2,200 something beds, which is a ton. We also see more, better, and specialized educational institutions. Boston is a good example that comes to mind. There's so many colleges, so many great colleges in Boston as well. You have Harvard, MIT, Tufts, Boston College, Boston University. There's a good bit more as well. There's a lot of more vocation, maybe job training centers, a lot more headquarters in high population density areas as well. Georgia Institute of Technology is in Atlanta, Georgia. It's right by the very crowded interstate too. But UGA, the University of Georgia, rankings for UGA are lower than Georgia Tech. I'm not throwing any shade at UGA. It's a good school. I'm just merely stating a fact. So the more specialized, maybe the higher ranking school is going to be in that more urban area, while UGA, which is a good school, just more lower ranking, is in a more dispersed rural area. We also see more cultural amenities, places of recreation. A more dense area is probably going to have a lot more movie theaters than a rural area. This kind of goes back to the stereotype that when there's nothing to do in a small town, you go to the parking lot and you just open up your trunk. There you go. So yeah. There's also a higher standard of living in areas that have a higher population density as well. You can go to ball games for major teams in urban areas. Now in urban areas, we also see more crowded living because there's a lot more people in a small amount of land, higher crime rates, and a need for transportation and service infrastructure. So yeah, a lot less people will have cars in a urban area compared to a rural area because, yeah, places are a lot closer together. But when people need to get across the city, they got to get there somehow. So you'll need public bus services, you'll need bike paths, you'll also need maybe subways. The L in Chicago is a major transportation service that gets people across the city. So yeah, diverse cultural and social structures also develop in urban areas. We may see a lot of different religious infrastructures in a city. When I was in Boston last year, I passed by a lot of different churches of different denominations. I've passed by different religious temples for other religions. I've passed by synagogues. If you go to a more rural area, you may see just churches or just synagogues as well. Going back to Utah, you see a lot more Mormon facilities, but if you leave that state, you'll see a lot less Mormon facilities. In areas that have a higher population density, you see a lot of different cultures. You see multiculturalism, and this could lead to the cultural exchange of different characteristics within those cultures. Now, what are the social effects of low population density? Well, we see a lot more closer-knit communities. Residents tend to know each other personally. It goes back to a stereotype that if you're in a small town and you go to Walmart with your mom, she's going to run into like 3 people she went to high school with. There's limited access to recreational amenities, so teenagers hanging out in parking lots. Low-density areas typically have fewer healthcare facilities, or they may be further away. So if you're having a baby in a rural area, keep that in mind. There also may be fewer educational institutions. In more populated areas or areas experiencing population growth, there's a lot of different schools maybe throughout the area. But in a lot of dispersed areas, you may see a county or a city high school. There's also restricted mobility. There's typically less walkability. You're going to have to use your car more. It's very dependent because rural areas with low population density are more spread out. So to get from place to place, like to go into town to get groceries, you're going to need a car. There's low public transportation services as well, just because there's not much of a need for it as well. There's also a lower economic base, so they may not be able to fund it. There's also higher emergency response times. This goes back to everything kind of being more spread out most of the time. So it's going to take longer for an ambulance to get to you. And there's also typically a lower standard of living in low population areas. Now, what about the political effects? How does this affect the governments and the politics? Well, high-density urban areas have larger populations, duh, slap on the head, and this results in greater representation in local, regional, and national governments and politics and political issues. So issues that are relevant in New York City and Los Angeles are going to make their way to Washington, D.C., than areas that are relevant in Meridian, Mississippi, just because there is a lot more population density in Los Angeles and New York City, and that's just how it is. Areas with high population density, of course, are going to impact their local politics, but major cities in like states or provinces of countries are going to impact the state governments as well. So major cities in Georgia, like Savannah and Atlanta, are going to impact the overall Georgia politics more than smaller towns and communities throughout Georgia. That's just how it is. Electoral districts for in the United States is what I'm talking about, are going to be smaller because they have to have the same number of people within them, but there's going to be a lot more electoral districts, allowing for more direct representation in urban areas. So a lot more electoral districts will represent the different groups within the urban areas as well. Politics will prioritize policies that address high population dense challenges, urban challenges like transportation, housing affordability and accessibility, infrastructure to support the people, as well as environmental sustainability. And the environmental sustainability one is one that's coming up a lot more because people have realized that if you all live in one area, you're putting a lot of pressure on the environment, a lot of pressure to grow food and agriculture. So people are trying to figure out what is the most sustainable way to live, and the most sustainable way to live in an urban area. Urban politics focus on urban issues. Rural politics focus on rural issues. Politics can impact political party alignment. Liberals tend to live more in urban areas. Conservatives tend to live more in rural areas, where areas are a lot more dispersed. That's just how it is. If there's any protests or lobbying efforts, any major social movements, these are typically done in urban areas as well, because you have a lot more people and because you have a lot more people to reach. There's higher government involvement and funding for infrastructure in dense areas because there's just a higher population to reach. Government's going to want to support as many citizens as possible. Cities often can serve as international hubs with global influence, like London, which is home of the London Stock Exchange. Or there could be a lot of diplomacy going on. This is a picture, the third picture, is of New York City in the United Nations building, which is a big hub for the United Nations. which is a big international organization that doesn't do as much as they should, but they do exist. So what are the political effects of low population density? Well, areas that have lower population density will have fewer residents spread out, resulting in a smaller number of electoral districts. Look at here the cartogram. Look at Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota. The electoral districts are fewer, but they're bigger. And they have less representation in politics, particularly national politics. An issue in Idaho may not get to DC as great as an issue in California or Texas. Rural communities prioritize local governments to a greater extent, as well as participatory decision-making and community-led initiatives and community movements to address local priorities and concerns. Politics in low-density areas will focus on rural-specific issues like agriculture and natural resource management, of course, infrastructure development, most recently broadband access, and more. Lower digital engagement is also prominent in rural areas. There's also lower civic participation in rural areas as well. Now, what about the environmental effects of high population density? Well, in areas that are more densely populated, we see a lot more air pollution. Areas that have a lot of industry, this could be from their factories, vehicles all clustered together can create a accumulation of vehicle emissions, construction projects, as well as residential heating. So what does that mean? Well, dense urban landscapes, of course, have a lot of concrete and asphalt and buildings, and these surfaces can absorb and retain heat. And this will lead to urban areas having larger, not by like a lot, but measurable differences in temperature compared to rural areas. Rural areas are typically a little more cooler than urban areas. Surfaces in urban areas like the roads and the concretes, they're not porous. So when it rains, water can't just seep through the sidewalks. They'll seep through the grass, but there's a lot less grass compared to rural areas. So what does this happen? Well, when it rains, the water is going to run off. It can lead to flooding. It can overwhelm the drainage systems. It can lead to water pollution. And it can pollute with sediment, chemicals. It can bring debris into the cities. It can also bring all this stuff into local bodies of water, like the Hudson River, right outside of New York City. It can lead to generation of large volumes of solid waste. When you have all of that people together, you're going to create a lot of waste in a small amount of land. And this is not just from residents, but also commercial and industrial activities. Urban areas, of course, have a lot of people who own cars, and this can lead to traffic congestion there's also vehicle emissions as well as noise pollution because cars are loud. People typically aren't that loud compared to cars. So this is a picture of urban Rio. This is a favela favelas. These are multiple favelas in urban Rio. So these are settlements that are created not by any housing projects, not by the government. These are settlements created by the people who could not afford or access housing in the city. And these infrastructure are very dangerous, and poor management of this infrastructure leads to water issues, sanitation issues, because you have all these people close together and it's not being monitored by any services like recycling. There's also issues with drainage and flooding as well. So there's a lot of harmful effects of these urban favelas in Rio. This is rural Canada, somewhere in Canada. I don't know where. Canada is pretty big here. But we can see here there's a lot of land, a lot more grass. We're probably not going to see as much stormwater runoff when it rains. The water is just going to go through the ground and grow crops. It's a lot more dispersed, a lot less people are living there as well. So yeah, this is the rural Netherlands. Not all of rural Netherlands looks like this, but this is just a flower farm, essentially. The Netherlands produces like 1.7 billion cuts of flowers each year, and that's, I think, 60% of global trade in the flower industry. It's like the Silicon Valley of flowers is the Netherlands. And of course, they need a lot of land for these flowers. Rural Nigeria, this is slash and burn agriculture. It's an agriculture practice in rural Nigeria, and they're doing this to create a lot of crops. Slash and burn agriculture requires a lot of land to do, so you can't really do it in a big city. So yeah, and And this has come up as a major issue in rural areas because people are starting to realize that this agriculture can very much do a lot of harm to the soil. So they're trying to figure out what's a sustainable way to grow crops in rural Nigeria. The cost of living is, of course, lower. The crime rates are, of course, lower. But the standard of living is also lower in rural Nigeria and rural Canada and rural anywhere for the most part. All right, let's look at carrying capacity. This is a term that College Board just asked this year on the FRQs, the year 2024, which is when I'm recording this. But it's still relevant because it could show up on your AP exam again. So we're going to cover it. So don't get scared from either of these two pictures, particularly the one of the left, because they definitely put lipstick on this earth. So carrying capacity is the maximum number of people that a specific area can support with the resources. So what's the maximum number of people we can feed? What's the maximum number of people we can house? And what's the maximum number of people we can provide drinking water to, essentially? So carrying capacity. If you use resources, you are getting closer to reaching carrying capacity. If you're using less resources, you're going further away from carrying capacity. So let's look back at this graph here. So we can see here that exponential growth occurs and then you reach carrying capacity, which can stay static or it can decrease or it can increase. This one just happens to increase. Once you get above carrying capacity, what the pattern is that populations will decrease and then they'll increase and decrease again. And that will eventually is supposed to level itself out until carrying capacity changes. If it changes, then this might happen again. So if you go above carrying capacity, population levels typically decrease to some extent due to famine, water shortages, housing shortages, reduced access to services, spread of disease. Look at how many people are here in this town in India. There's just so many people. You're going to spread a common cold or COVID very, very quickly, lead to a bunch of health problems. There could be strain on job markets from all the competition. There could be energy crisis because you had to support this much people. Imagine the electricity that this city has to supply. There's also going to be a lot of migration away from the city as well. Now, humans can increase and decrease carrying capacity. You can decrease carrying capacity through harming the environment, but you can also increase carrying capacity, such as technological innovations. Fridges are excellent because you can make food last longer, which is just great. Your milk won't spoil 10 minutes after you get it. There's also healthcare and medical innovations. Penicillin has saved lives through basically curing people of bacterial infections. Sustainable practices in farming that allow us to preserve the land for future generations helps us increase the carrying capacity. Urban farming, farming on the rooftops of buildings, have also increased carrying capacity in urban areas because people can grow food from themselves or their local areas. If we have more efficient resource management and acquisition, if we use resources and without depleting them, because there's some resources that we can deplete, then we will increase our carrying capacity by preserving them or increasing them. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It really does help me out, and it costs $0. I have some free resources for you in the description down below if you'd like to use them. If you have any AP Human Geography related questions whatsoever, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below the video or send me a message on Discord. I'll see you guys in the next video, though. Adios.